Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. It's episode 2657 of The Tom Woods Show, and I'm delighted to welcome a former U.S. Senator Phil Gramm, whom you all know, no doubt. And I would say a particularly distinguished feature of his bio is that it's a rare phenomenon that an economics professor, which he was at Texas A&M University, goes on to become a U.S. congressman and senator, as Phil Gramm did. And I want to talk to him today about a brand new book he has with Don Boudreau, who's been a guest on this program also. It's called The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism. Senator Gramm, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
All right, let's start it. I love this book because these are 7 myths that make me crazy. And
yeah, well, they're the 7 great myths of American capitalism. So if you understand American markets and how they work, and American history and the role that capitalism has played, these 7 myths do irritate you.
Well, you start right in a way from the beginning, because the controversy over the Industrial Revolution, has existed for some time, and there was a debate called the Standard of Living debate, and the historians on either side were known as the optimists and the pessimists. And I think on balance, the historians came out on balance on the optimist side, but I think the general public never found out about any of that. So the general public just remembers, well, I saw some really terrible drawings in my history book about how bad the conditions were. So the Industrial Revolution must have been a catastrophe for people. And yet, turns out this is not exactly an accurate rendering of what happened.
Well, I'd say it's about as far from the truth as it could be. Fortunately, we have British and American statistics from roughly 1800 on. And in Britain especially, British statistics in Victorian literature about the Industrial Revolution paint 2 totally different pictures. And you've got to realize that let me explain it this way. From the fall of the Roman Empire until about 1800, people lived pretty much like their grandparents had lived. And they lived in excruciating poverty, and things didn't change. And then suddenly, around 1800, we had the Enlightenment, which was a consensus of thinking that people should have the right to think their own thoughts, to worship God in their own way, and that people own their own labor and the fruits of their own thrift. And the power of that idea, embodied in capitalism, produced a situation where if you look at per capita income in Britain or America, or the world for that matter, and it doesn't change for 1,000 years, and then all of a sudden, around 1800, it starts to rise, and then about 1840, it just takes off. And you got to realize that the Industrial Revolution created not only incredible productivity, but it created a wave of creative destruction. Workers that had been basically born in a manner and stayed in that same manner, working for the people who lived in the manor house their whole lives, suddenly were freed to vote with their feet, to go to the cities to work in factories. In fact, not until about 1800, for most people, was there a labor contract. So 6 million people voted with their feet in 100 years to move from the countryside to London. The landed gentry dominated British literature and either wrote it or funded the people who did write it. And they're losing from the Industrial Revolution. And then as political power shifts, the Corn Laws are repealed, they really are losing. Because now, while food prices are dramatically lower, living standards are higher, the landed gentry is worse off. And so we get a very distorted picture from British literature. A perfect example, and I'll stop, is A Christmas Carol, written by Charles Dickens, 1843. Mm-hmm. Charles Dickens, in telling the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, all he could envision was the world he had seen. And in the world he had seen, the only way poor people in Britain could be better off was charity. And so the problem with Ebenezer Scrooge is he was a Scrooge. What he didn't realize in 1843, at that very moment the book was written, that we had already started an ascent that has never ended. And by everything from per capita income to average lifespan to decline in child labor to a decline in child mortality to the general well-being of the public, the 100 years from 1800 to 1900, first in Britain and then in America, was a golden age for workers. Now, capitalists got rich, but workers got richer. Everybody benefited from the Industrial Revolution. And in America, you had the progressives were so obsessed with 4,600 millionaires in 1896 that they turned a blind eye to 66 million Americans who had seen their living standards rise faster since the Civil War than any people who had ever lived on the face of the earth. So the Industrial Revolution was a revolution that benefited working people. And the great thing is the revolution still is going on.
In your book, you quote the historian T.S. Ashton, which made me dig out one of my favorite quotations from him. He said, this is in the mid-20th century, he says, "There are today in the plains of India and China men and women, plague-ridden and hungry, living lives little better than those of the cattle that toil with them. Such Asiatic standards and such unmechanized horrors are the lot of those who increase their numbers without passing through an industrial revolution." Quite striking, indeed, quite striking.
Yeah, well, and you got to remember that the Industrial Revolution made it possible for man to produce goods and services faster than he reproduced. And it changed everything. And it was the beginning of the success that has come by letting economic freedom and markets work.
Now, I want to jump ahead, if I may, to one that is probably, in our day and age, the most controversial claim you're making in the book. And I think you know which one I mean, because it involves trade. And trade, of course, is front and center in all the headlines these days. And what we've heard from quite a few people over the years is that, quote unquote, free trade has hollowed out American manufacturing. Now, this is either true or false. So somebody's right about this and somebody else is wrong. And yet both sides of this debate are absolutely convinced that they're right. And yet you would think it would just be a matter of producing the data and somebody has to admit he's wrong and the other one is right. What is the truth as you see it on that question?
Well, first of all, it depends on what you call hollowing out. If you're talking about industrial production, and as you know, the president constantly talks about we don't produce anything anymore. But if you're talking about industrial production, we produce 2.5 times as much in industrial production value as we did in 1975, the last time we ran a trade surplus. And we do it not with 33% of the labor force, which we did in 1953, but with 8.1% of the labor force because of the extraordinary growth in labor productivity. We are far and away, as Americans, have the most productive workers in manufacturing in the world. So in terms of production, we are producing more. We're producing them with fewer people. And I think it's important to note what happened in the immediate post-war period. You got to realize when the war ended, we were the only country in the world that had our industrial production intact. The rest of the productive capacity of the world had been largely destroyed. 50 million of their most skilled workers had been killed, and our industrial capacity was intact. So for 30 years, we had a monopoly in manufacturing. But as the world recovered and started to produce heavy manufacturing again, we found ourselves in competition, and we competed by getting more efficient and by using better and sharper tools. But the net result was that we have become better off. Now, let me just give you one more statistic and then talk about this obsession with manufacturing. In the 29 years from the beginning of the post-war period until 1975, per capita GDP grew by 2.1%, and we ran trade surpluses throughout that whole period. And Americans invested very heavily in rebuilding Japan and rebuilding Europe. And in fact, today, 40% of the earnings of the Fortune 500 companies comes from the investment that started during that period. But then in the next 29 years, when we ran trade deficits every year, per capita GDP growth was 2.2%, actually a little bit higher. I would say they were identical. There is no evidence to substantiate the claim that running capital surpluses, where people have so much confidence in America that they invest their money here, there is no evidence that having capital surpluses and trade deficits in any way diminishes America's future. Now, the president has this notion that real growth is from manufacturing. But the average wage in manufacturing is now below the average wage in services. And this idea that we can bring back manufacturing by imposing tariffs that raise the price of clothing in Walmart, that we're going to bring back textile mills. Who wants to work in those textile mills? My mother left a tenant farm to work at the Eagle and Phoenix Mill 83 years ago. And she worked there for about 3 years. And then she spent 20 years working in a hospital trying to eliminate 2 jobs in the mill, my job and my brother's job. And she was successful at both. So if we took money away from artificial intelligence investment to build cotton mills, who wants to work in them? There are better jobs out there. 49% of people responding to the NFIB questionnaire last month said that they couldn't find people to fill the manufacturing jobs they had. So this is a sort of a nostalgia, misunderstanding of how Americans value things. We are buying fewer and fewer manufacturing goods relative to the amount we spend on services. And we are in a cycle in manufacturing that's very similar to what happened in agriculture in the 20th century. At the beginning of the century, we had about 40% of the people in America working on the farm. At the end of the century, we had 2% working on the farm. In the Farm Bill in 1998, I offered an amendment saying we could never have more people working in the Department of Agriculture than we had involved in production manufacturing. The amendment failed, astoundingly. But does anybody say we hollowed out manufacturing? Agriculture? We produce 100 times what we did in 1900. And we do it with fewer people, more technology, better plant genetics. And we're in the same cycle in manufacturing. And jobs in manufacturing compared to total employment have been declining since 1953, and they're going to continue to decline. And efforts by government to artificially force people into manufacturing will waste resources, and it's not what people want. Those are not the jobs people want.
I'm telling you, you should have seen Father's Day in the Woods household. Daughters Veronica and Elizabeth made the old man here the most delicious steak dinner you've ever seen. Father's Day season or any time of year is a great time to treat Dad or that special someone or even yourself to the unique gift of Omaha steaks. And stay tuned because I've got a discount for you. Our family's been enjoying Omaha steaks since at least 2010. We started ordering it for the convenience, and it was so delicious, and we always had a whole bunch of steaks ready to go. And when that package arrived at the door, how thrilling and exciting. Every steak is perfectly aged to maximize tenderness and hand-cut by master butchers. And you'll love ordering from them. Omaha Steaks has been America's original butcher since 1917. And don't forget, it's not just steak. It's also burgers, chicken, pork, seafood, dessert, not to mention easy-to-prepare comfort food. So this Father's Day, but indeed Father's Day season, give Dad the world's best steak experience with Omaha Steaks. Visit omahasteaks.com for guaranteed perfect gifts that deliver legendary quality. And for an extra $35 off, use promo code WOODS at checkout. That's omahasteaks.com and an extra $35 off with promo code WOODS at checkout. See site for details. Well, I think what some people are conflating two different things. They're saying free trade has made people worse off. And then when somebody tries to argue against that, they say, well, look, the average person today just starting out is going to find it much more difficult to buy a house than did his parents, and a lot of other things seem to be out of his reach. So that moves us on to another topic, but they conflate it with free trade. But we want to say that the market economy makes people better off and better off and better off. But it's hard to argue with people who say, in this day and age, it's a lot harder to get that first house and do some of those things. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think it depends on the first house. The lady who runs my life at work just bought her first house, and she typed every page of this book. And so she said, I'm convinced by all the arguments you make, but why is it so hard to make ends meet? And so I said, well, her name is Muriel. Muriel, maybe your ends are pretty far apart. I said to her, she just bought her first house. How does your first house compare to the first house that your mother and father bought? Her response, my first house is better than any house they ever lived in, including the house they live in now. 80% of all poverty housing in America is air conditioned today. 50 years ago, only 20% of houses in America were air conditioned. So the first house is expensive today because of the first house that people are buying, and because government's borrowing so much money that interest rates are higher than they were only 5 years ago. But whose fault is that? It is not the fault of trade. And if free trade makes people worse off, why do they do it? They don't have to buy goods produced abroad. Nobody's making them do it. Why do they do it? They do it because they're better off. Now, the president thinks if You buy something from somebody or from a country, and they don't buy the same amount for you, you're being cheated. But as I try to explain to people in the administration, for the last 23 years, I've shopped at Walmart in a little town near, I live out in the country. And I've probably spent $100,000 at Walmart. They have never bought a single thing from me, nothing. But am I worse off? Am I being exploited? No. I wouldn't shop there if I were being exploited. So this whole notion, really, when you listen to what these people are saying, they're saying, look, we're not creating the kind of jobs we should be creating. And we're not doing it because of free trade and open ability of people to spend their own money. And if you let them decide what jobs are important and what jobs we're going to create, that they could do a better job than the market is doing. Well, it's one of the oldest ideas in history, and it's been tried for 5,000 years, and it has never worked. This is the old guardians, Plato's guardians, who know more than we do, who can make these decisions for us. If we just turned our lives over to them, we could be better off. It's never worked, never going to work. So the argument about trade, there's not an element to it that has any truth, except where you've got a very narrow national defense argument. But even that argument is the most abused part of our trade policy. The president just imposed a 50% tariff on iron and steel in the name of national defense. Well, where do we get our iron and steel? Brazil, Canada, and Mexico. So how is our national security threatened? And if we drive up the cost of steel, we're getting ready to spend $100 billion on defense. It's like we've imposed an embargo against ourselves. And the effectiveness of that spending is going to be dramatically reduced.
I want to skip over, I don't want to cover all 7 because then this would be a Joe Rogan interview and people would walk away thinking they'd read the whole book, and I think they should buy the book and read it. I've talked about and written about the financial crisis and deregulation. I've had Peter Wallison, you may know him, on the show.
I know him well.
A couple of times. He did enormously useful work on that. But let's talk about a couple of other things that I think are more in the news now, since that was 2008. And the topic of income inequality just won't go away. And everyone just takes for granted that income inequality is a serious problem. And we need to have some kind of active policy to fight back against it. So how much of this is a matter of people just don't know the right statistics, or how much of it is a value argument that maybe we have income inequality, but I don't think that's a bad thing, but they do? I mean, how much of it is a philosophical dispute, and how much of it is a dispute over statistics?
Both. It's some of both. Let me give you the statistics, and then let me talk about the value argument. The basic measure of income that all of these inequality numbers are based on is household income. It's measured by the Census Bureau. And starting in 1948, the Census Bureau, for simplicity, defined income as payments you receive in cash and cash equivalent. And in 1948, there weren't many payments in kind where people gave you things but didn't give you money. But then in 1965, with the war on poverty, virtually every element of that program was in kind. And the Census Bureau counts none of those payments as income to the recipients. So, for example, it doesn't take into account taxes. So if you get the IRS is now the largest welfare agency in the country. When you get a check from the IRS, a refundable tax credit, misnomer, but that doesn't count as income, even though it's in cash. Because they don't count taxes as income loss to people who pay taxes, they don't count tax payments as income to people who receive the benefits. And so now 88% of the transfer payments to the bottom 20% of income earners does not count as income. Refundable tax credits, debit cards that have the ability to buy food, and because the food, we call them food stamps, but it's a debit card. You take to the grocery store, you buy food. Rent subsidies where the government pays your rent, Medicaid. And so the Census Bureau says the bottom 20% of income recipients has an income of about, on average, about $29,000. But if you count all transfer payments and tax refunds, the income is about $65,000 on average. And then on the upper end, the top 20% of income earners pay 42% of their income in federal, state, and local taxes. So the Census Bureau says the ratio of the top 20% of earners to the bottom 20% is 16.7 to 1. But if you count all transfer payments as income and all taxes paid as income lost, the ratio is 4 to 1, not 16.7 to 1. And you can say 4 to 1 is too much. It's a very different debate. Also, when you correct for those errors and you use IRS data, or you adjust the census data for problems that they have by change definition, the level of income inequality today is lower than it was in 1948, very slightly. So we're having a debate about income inequality, which is supposedly growing and is a massive problem politically and economically, when in fact income inequality is not growing. Okay, that's the first point. Secondly, are we poor because Musk is richer? I have this satellite on my house, and it cost about a third of the system I had before, and it's at least twice as good. So Elon Musk is very rich. I wish I were as rich. But I'm richer because he's rich. I'm not poorer because he's rich. I mean, when somebody graduates from college and their income is roughly twice what the average high school graduate gets, is he taking it away from the average high school graduate? No. He created it by improving his human capital. And finally, let me say about Piketty and about the ProPublica. Piketty's gimmick is, it's really threefold. First of all, he counts no transfer payments as income. So all the benefits you get from government, he doesn't count. And then he not only doesn't take into account taxes that people pay in upper income levels, but he changes the definition of income. So income, as he measures it, is what your income would be if you sold all the assets you had every year, your retirement, your house, your car, any equities or bonds you own, and paid taxes on it. Well, that's a phony measure. The second thing he does is he looks at a very tiny percentage of people. You probably saw the article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about 14 people that are mega wealthy. Well, we have a worldwide market now. So if you come up with a powerful idea, you can become very wealthy. But did any of those 14 people make you poorer by becoming richer? Bill Gates owns now a very small part of Microsoft. About 70% of it is owned by pension funds, insurance companies, 401ks, IRAs. He's made not only himself rich, but he's made us richer. So, and finally, Piketty plays this game of saying he never says somebody earned income. He says they took it, they claimed it, they seized it. But that's not the way income works. In a free society, only criminals and government get something for nothing. Everybody else has to earn it. And so if they earn it, they created something of value other people wanted. And the fact that there are people richer than me, it doesn't make me poor. I think that's a key point. But if you can choose to be born beautiful and brilliant and rich, do it. But being normal and ugly and ordinary doesn't disqualify you in America.
Hey, gang, tell me if this sounds familiar. They tell you to max out your 401k and IRA and then make you beg for permission to use your own money. They tell you to defer paying your taxes by saving in a 401k or IRA because you'll retire in a lower tax bracket. But if that were true, why are so many retirees in the highest tax bracket of their lives? It's time to get the truth and discover a better way to grow and protect your money. Bank on Yourself is the proven retirement plan alternative banks and Wall Street desperately hope you never hear about. It gives you guaranteed, predictable growth and retirement income with no luck, skill, or guesswork required. Your plan doesn't go backward when the markets tumble. Your principal and growth are locked in. You're in control. You get access to your money for emergencies and opportunities with no questions asked. There are no government penalties or restrictions on how much or when you can take it. And when you use your money, it keeps growing like you never touched it. Try doing that with a 401k or IRA. And perhaps the best reason of all, you'll know the minimum guaranteed value of your retirement savings on the day you plan to tap into them and at every point along the way. You can get a free report with all the details on how the Bank on Yourself strategy adds guarantees, predictability, and control to your financial plan. Just go to bankonyourself.com/woods. That's bankonyourself.com/woods. If it's me, I don't care that there are people wealthier than I am. That doesn't bother me in any way. And I know that it's not the cause of why I'm not wealthier than I am. These thoughts never even enter my mind. But related to this issue, because to me, what matters is the absolute level that everybody's at. If the poor people are much poorer than the wealthy, but they're still wealthier than people in the rest of the world and wealthier than almost anyone who's ever lived, that's all that really matters to me. But this issue that you also talk about in the book about poverty, people think that if it weren't for capitalism, the poor would be wealthier. And what seems to be the case is that if you look at the countries of the world, the ones that have the most economic freedom, the poor suffer the fewest deprivations in those particular countries. But yet there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that we hear all the time about people who find it very difficult to get decent paying jobs, and they're struggling with multiple jobs, and their costs of housing and healthcare are so high. And I don't know, can we just set that aside, or how do we account for that?
No, listen, we can account for it. It's as old as man on earth. There have always been people who have tried to gain power by creating resentment between the most productive members of society and the least productive. In America today, well, let me just give you a couple of numbers. When the welfare program started in earnest with the funding ramp up in 1967, 78% of all households in the bottom 20% of income recipients worked. The number today is 36%. Now, what has happened is that we have provided such generous benefits that people that don't have much in the way of skills or ambition have simply chosen to take the benefits and not work. And whose fault is that? And I also think government has failed people in the education system, especially in the inner city. So if you really care about poor people, one, you ought to be for mandatory work requirement, because they're people that have real ability that never discovered it. People say capitalism failed poor people. In America, poor people, except for benefiting from capitalism, because the money the government has that capitalism creates, they're not part of capitalism. They're not working. They're not on the escalator that has moved up living standards pretty consistently throughout American history. And so, again, you have people, the Department of Agriculture does a survey where they ask people, have you ever been insecure about having money to buy food, even for one day in the last year? And anybody who says yes, then everybody in their household is counted as being food insecure. Now, there's been a lot of research that shows that when you increase food stamps, you still get the same number of people who answer the question the same way. But you see all of these statements about millions of people who are hungry. And it's all built on distorting government statistics. There are people in America who do have inadequate housing and food, but they're basically people who have got some problem. They've got a physical problem or a mental problem or an alcohol problem or a drug problem. And you're not going to reach those people by increasing food stamps because they're not applying for them. And so we're over and over and over increasing these benefits that don't reach the truly needy. And we don't go out and really find out what's going on with these people that really have a problem that's not being addressed. That's sort of my reading of the poverty problem in America. And you've seen the statistics that if you work in America, you're not going to be poor. If you get married before you have children, you're not going to be poor. I mean, if you look at the facts, you have to make a lot of bad choices or have a lot of real problems like drug addiction or alcoholism to be poor in America. So I just don't buy the logic of it. And I've looked at the problem pretty closely.
I remember a long time ago, Brent Bozell at the Media Research Center critiquing some report on maybe CBS News, talking about millions of American children were, quote, starving. I forget what the exact figure was, but it was a figure that was completely at odds with your lived experience. I mean, if there were this many millions of children, you would have come across one. And he wanted to know, how did they reach that figure? And the answer was, they had asked the question, did you go to bed hungry at any time during the year, whatever year it was? And if the answer was yes, you were described as starving, which is not quite the same thing.
Well, actually, the question that they do ask is not, did you go to bed hungry, but was there ever a day that you thought that your family might not have enough money to buy food in the future? And again, as I mentioned earlier, that there have been numerous studies that show that that number of people who answer the question that way has nothing to do with the amount of benefits they're getting. the number doesn't go down when you provide more food stamps.
Well, I'd like to recommend that people read this, because this is the stuff that, you don't get taught this in school. If anything, you get taught the opposite. I mean, let's face it. You get taught the opposite. What you learn about the Great Depression is the opposite of what's in this book. If they're teaching the financial crisis of 2008 yet in the schools, that's going to be the Paul Krugman version of things. So that's not going to be right. So you got to this will inoculate you against falsehoods. And also this book has the effect of opening up your brain and physically pulling out nonsense that you've been taught over the years. So it's highly valuable. It's the Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism, co-authored by our wonderful guest today, Senator Phil Gramm. I appreciate your time, Senator Gramm.
Oh, listen, I appreciate you very much, Tom. And let me just say that I think if you read this book, you'll find that we have a greater country than you realized. And secondly, when we're outlining the myth in each of these historical periods and in the 2 contemporary issues of the day, poverty and inequality, we cite pretty consistently the best-selling high school textbook and the best-selling college textbook as part of the myth.
Yeah.
So, look, it's hard. I remember when I started studying economics, I was reading a book on the history of American banking by a guy named Hammond at the University of Chicago. And he begins the book by saying, before you begin this book, you need to realize that virtually everything you know about American banking is wrong. And sure enough, by the time you finish the book, you realize that he's right. Everything you knew was wrong. But the people who wrote it were reading the newspaper or listening to contemporary accounts. And Piketty, the economist from France, he cites Victorian literature as evidence. And his argument is people could not have written a Christmas Carol. They couldn't have written the line from the Song of the Shark, "Oh God, that bread should be so dear and flesh and blood so cheap," had they not experienced it. Well, I mean, when you're quoting fiction as fact, you know that your data source is pretty weak. So look, America's not perfect. We're not the shining city on a hill yet. We probably are never going to get back in the Garden of Eden alive. But our system works well for the people who work. And I think that's really the lesson of the book. And you can just Google the Triumph of Economic Freedom, and up will pop a bunch of people selling the book. Buy it and read it. Because there's a lot in it, I think you'll find, that reassures you about America and about the country you believe in and the values you have that are constantly under assault.
Well, Senator Gramm, thank you once again for your time. I endorse the book wholeheartedly. People should read it. It's also a good reference because it's got every number, every great cutting quotation, everything you want is sitting there at the ready. So thank you, Senator Gramm, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.